topographically. Yeah, so we're talking about topographically generated internal waves as a response to wind forcing. So this is just a bit of an intro. This is my favorite place at the Australian National University campus. And what I like about it is it's quite idyllic, but behind that tree is Australia's supercomputer. So on that side, there's a supercomputer, and behind you, there's a particle accelerator. But you have this nice, quiet little spot where we go kayaking in the mornings. And so, yeah, this research is supported by the Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes, who flew me over here very nicely, and NCI is where I do all my computation. Cool. So I thought intro slide. Not everyone does internal waves, but as you can see from this video, we have this pattern of, this is the velocity field you can see, and you can see, oh no, I wanted to play the video again. Yeah, so basically we have increasing stratification as you go down the water column, as you might expect, typically in the ocean. And then as you have oscillatory flow over topography, you get these beams that propagate upwards at an angle from the topography. But so looking at that, that might look like what you'd expect from internal tides. So these tidal beams you might have studied. But that video was actually generated not from any tidal forcing, but the only forcing in this domain was winds. So why are we looking at this? The original motivation was that Andy, just before I started my PhD, was working on this paper. So he was looking at high frequency wind fluctuations and how that affects bottom water transport in the Southern Ocean. And so the mechanism, basically what they found was that, so most of this plot isn't important, but the main thing here is that your wind stress here, the momentum from that wind stress will be translated through the water column via both interfacial form stress, so that's stresses on different isopycnal layers in the ocean, and then also directly to the topography. And what they found was that at longer timescales, so on the timescales of several weeks, your interfacial form stress would become important. So your internal layers would adjust to the surface forcing. But what they also found was that at short timescales, so very fast wind forcing, you have very little contribution from the interfacial form stress, which actually intrigued Andy in particular, because that implies that you have a pathway for rapid transmission of information from the surface straight to the bottom. So with rapid winds, you might expect that there's nothing really going on in the middle, and you feel this momentum or stress directly through topographic form stress at the bottom. And as another motivation, there's been some studies, some observational studies, where we've seen, so Hans van Haren has seen intensified mixing at the bottom of the ocean, quite deep, after a storm has passed across the surface. So this isn't waves propagating from the surface down, this is near instantaneous intensified mixing at the bottom. And yeah, he wasn't really sure what caused this. And there's another paper where he found this at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. So this is a mooring that was, I think, close to 8,000 or 10,000 meters deep. And again, when this cyclone passed across the red mooring, there was this near instantaneous excitation of bottom mixing. And he also found a signature of internal wave breaking at the bottom. So not to say that this is definitely the mechanism, but it's a motivation to look at this connection between the surface and the bottom. So to motivate it a bit more through the theory, you've probably seen this picture before. It's all many of the different internal wave-driven mixing processes. The two of the largest ones you'll be familiar with are wind-generated near inertial waves, which propagate downwards from the surface. So basically you get inertial oscillations near the surface and mixed layer, and then you have internal waves propagating into the interior. And then Another big component is the tidal flow. So you have oscillatory motions across bathymetry, and then you get those upward propagating waves that I showed you in the first video. Yeah, so very, very roughly, that can be a picture of the internal wave fields. And we wanted to see whether there's a connection via hydrostatic bottom pressure. So when you have these inertial oscillations, that will be felt near instantaneously, or the speed of sound at the bottom via changes in bottom pressure. And if you have changes in bottom pressure, then you would then have a resulting flow. So our hypothesis generally just, again, was if this, if we have some sort of wind stress at the surface, then as usual, you get your near inertial waves propagating away from the inertial oscillations. But you'll also have positive and negative fluctuations in the bottom pressure, this oscillatory flow. And then in much the same way as the internal tide, we can then have propagation up from the bottom. And on the right, we just summarize, if you ignore tides entirely, and other more exotic generation mechanisms for internal waves, then this could be a pathway for from wind generation to sources of internal waves. So like in the brown, we have the regular ones, inertial oscillations generated by the wind pulse, surface generated near inertial waves. And then in purple, this is our mechanism we're looking at. But of course, you'll also have topographic scatter, which will also contribute to the internal wave field. So in order to find these bottom generated waves, we have to make sure that we're not seeing scatter from downward propagating surface waves. So we designed a very idealized experiment using MOM6. So to the north and south, numerical isopycnal model, just with 5 layers. We tried 10, but there wasn't much difference, so 5 was cheaper. Rectangular domain, we made it quite large just to make it easy so that when our waves were generated, they'd have a long way to propagate and dissipate. So we wouldn't get reflection or re-entrant effects. And to help that further, on the north and south, we have Orlansky radiative boundary conditions. And that just basically means that when we have waves that hit the boundary condition matches the phase and allows them to exit the domain without reflection, in theory. And then east to west, we have a re-entrant condition. But typically our waves will dissipate before they reach that 4,000 kilometer mark, just through biharmonic diffusivity. We just have linear stratification, so it's very highly idealized. And the wind pulse that we chose was zonally symmetric storm band. So the symmetry will be important. I'll talk about that in a sec. But the idea was to keep it really, really simple. And the wind forcing profile, you have a peak and then an equal trough. And the reason for that is that we wanted to minimize the mean flow in the domain, just so that most of what we see will be wave dynamics. There'll be a bit of a mean flow because you can't always get rid of it. But it does mean that the net wind work was kept intentionally quite low. But that'll be important later. So the way we designed the experiment was to try to use the symmetry of the domain for filtering. So we did try some more fancy techniques, but in the end, it was just much easier when we had, so using symmetry, we know that because our wind pulse is zonally symmetric throughout the entire domain, and we just have one ridge in the middle of the topography, we know that our near inertial waves will propagate northward and southwards of the center line. And right in the middle, we have, we'll have a point where there's no near inertial wave generation. So there's kind of like this saddle point if you look at the surface height or the isopycnal heights right in the middle, which is nice because it means that if you look right along this line, you can't get any inertial oscillations that are directly from the wind. So these ones that are associated with our near inertial waves, which means that the only signal we can have along this line is from the asymmetry that we get from the topography. So here I've shown the ridge in the middle, and there's badly drawn wave fronts from our internal waves. And so then when I show you the results later, we've been looking along this center line to pick up the wave field we're interested in. And yeah, like I said before, that because the near inertial waves have the same frequency as well as what's scattered, they're sort of quite hard to separate. So we did try more interesting topography and domains, but then the scatter becomes a bit of a nuisance. So we've sort of settled on this really simplistic approach for now. And yeah, what we found fairly early on was what looked like internal waves. So like that video I showed you at the start, there's a screenshot here. So this has actually been temporarily filtered. And so we have you can see the isopycnal displacements and the upward propagating bands of velocity. And then you can also see, this is a Hofmöller plot going forward in time, again, taken along that center line of the topography, the center line of the wind forcing perpendicular to the topography. So our ridge is right in the middle. And then we see these bands of waves propagating so eastwards and westwards of the ridge. So this is just taking individual isopycnal and seeing its displacement. So really nothing fancy going on to get that plot from the symmetry. Then if we take the power spectrum, you can see quite clearly the internal wave signal. So here, this corresponds to the Coriolis frequency there. And all of these lines match very nicely with the vertical modes that you'd expect. So we've got 5 layers and got 5 vertical modes, more or less. It gets a bit messy towards the bottom, but yeah, we're really happy with how that lined up. So then we were really excited by this, and we thought, well, let's find out an analytic theory to see if we can match the numerics. So as a little bit of an interlude, we had a go at. We knew that we couldn't solve the shallow water equations in 3D on pencil and paper. Otherwise, we might as well just run a whole new numerical model. So we tried to solve the equations in the absence of topography. So just a few layers, only forced by winds, and then see what the response is at the bottom. We got this big, messy equation, but it did actually match the velocity really nicely. So we thought, great, in the absence of topography. So then we thought we'll use the approximation that your vertical velocity is given by the slope of your topography and the velocity to calculate the vertical velocity and in turn the energy flux, which is what we really wanted. But what we found was that there was just no match with the numerical results. Bit disappointing. We tried several other things, but what ended up being the problem was that the mechanism is fundamentally 3D. And you can think about this because, well, the bottom flow is a secondary effect to the winds. And so it's highly sensitive. So you'll have some of the flow is going to go around the hill in an elliptical shape, which does make sense. But then you also have effects of drag on the mean flow and the oscillation from the hill. So because you've got this back and forth between the bottom flow and the ridge, you can't represent it in this nice linear fashion, no matter how many equations we wrote down.
And then we flow around the ridge.
Around the ridge?
Yes, the ridge is just straight from south to north. So how can we flow? How can we have flow around the ridge?
Like along the ridge?
Around the ridge.
Around, you get, I guess you have, after the wind pulse has gone through, in the absence of topography, your velocity is oscillating sort of backwards and forwards zonally. I suppose I can show you this next video, maybe that. So this is just, we can keep, maybe this helps to answer your question, but this is just decomposing the fields very simply by subtracting the zonal or meridional averages. So you can see this is the meridional components of the velocity, the total, and then if you subtract the meridional component, if you were to trace particles around this, you actually get this sort of like elliptical shape around the ridge. due to the deviation. So your waves are sort of, your flow is getting deviated northwards and southwards due to conservation of angular momentum as parcels are picked up onto the ridge and then back down. They get, does that answer your question? No.
The ridge is a straight line from south to north, right?
Yes.
Changes.
No changes, no. But the wind band has a meridional extent to it. So it's a maximum in the middle and it decays. It's 300 meters. Sorry, the wind band is 300 kilometers wide north to south in the default case. So because you've got a meridional dependence on your wind band, that's what gives you that elliptical shape, I guess. Yeah, so this was just to sort of show you, like, we sort of assumed that, yes, you have this elliptical shape, but the dominant effect you still have a linear effect that's dominant if you make that two-dimensional assumption, but it just wasn't the case. So the analytic solution didn't quite work out. So then we just moved on to calculating the energy of the waves with some perturbation experiments. So changing around some of the properties of the wind pulse and the ocean itself. Okay, it doesn't want me to stop. Okay. Yeah, so we kept things really simple as well. This time we had some other energy flux calculations and that, but again, these were a little bit tricky because you did have still a small mean flow and the near inertial oscillations in the velocity field. So the velocity field ended up being more difficult to use than the interfacial heights. So we stuck with the interfacial heights to give us the potential energy of the waves, because they had very little interference from other processes. And yeah, so we calculated the potential energy and then estimated the total energy by basically taking the superinertial component of this spectrum and then using the energy partition for internal waves. So what we see here. And then we can compare the total wave energy to the equivalent wind work that was imparted above the topography. So this was a little bit arbitrary, but basically based on the deviation east to west of the zonal flow, we took a 50-kilometer band over the hill, and we supposed that the energy directly above the topography imparted by the wind was sort of the denominator when we were calculating the energy. So we're trying to calculate the total conversion rate of wind energy to wave energy. And so we did that by calculating the total wind work over the top of the topography zonally. So just a couple of perturbation experiments. Unfortunately, we don't have theory to compare against. We weren't able to get the analytical solution working, but if we modify the height, we get this exponential looking result, which is nice because that is actually what our theory did predict, which, yeah, does sort of make sense. And stratification, we were expecting things to sort of plateau after increasing stratification. But one issue we had with increasing stratification further was that as the angle of propagation changes, you start to get some numerical noise trying to resolve the waves. But basically, you can see on this secondary axis here that at the upper case, you have order of 1 or 2% energy conversion. What we're not suggesting this would be the energy conversion in the real ocean, because remember at the start, we intentionally designed our wind profile to have minimum wind work because the wind goes one way and then the other. So it sort of adds energy and then removes it, which means that most of the energy would then go into oscillations in the wave field. But still 1 or 2% in that case, it's not insignificant, you know, so we also modified the forcing duration and strength. And you can see, so I should have explained this before. In the orange, we have the total energy, if you can't quite see that. The black is the energy conversion rate percentage. And then the blue is the potential energy. So that's what we're measuring more directly. And yeah, this plot's a bit strange because I think there's some issues with how we're calculating the wind work, because I think the total, yeah, we're figuring out this anomaly here. Don't worry about it too much. But the important plot is the orange and blue, which shows you that you do have a peak at the Coriolis frequency, as you'd expect. So that means that you're going to have the most excitation of your, but as in the duration of the wind forcing matches Coriolis frequency, which means that the wind work has the most energy. It peaks around that band. So the wind profile is just a Gaussian and then flipped upside down. But yeah, the dominant frequency is how long the wind is on for in the first place. So it makes sense that we have this peak here. And forcing strength, as you might expect, the total energy goes up with forcing strength, but the conversion rate, ignore this because we're just dividing by a small number here really, but it settles right down to basically saying your conversion rate shouldn't be too dependent on the forcing strength in the first place. Yeah, so conclusions and remaining questions. Obviously, this is very idealized setup. We don't expect it to necessarily be 1% in the ocean, but it's enough to suggest that it could be worth looking into more, especially since we had those, there's some observations of this connection. Whether or not this is the mechanism, it's certainly worth looking into in a more realistic model. Another thing to think about is that in this idealized setup, when these waves are generated, they will propagate. But in the real ocean, you might get this bottom flow. You maybe even would get the waves generated, but you could expect that they're immediately broken or just dissipated. So rather than seeing a wave field, you could also just be expecting to see extra mixing like we saw in Panharen's paper. But just one thing to think about. Analytic theory, if anyone has any ideas, please let me know. Another approach for it. It'd be good to just get a good scaling argument as you change different parameters, being able to predict how the bottom energy will change. And yeah, so future study, it'd be good to look at a high resolution model output or observations and basically just do a statistical study. So look at where are the winds, where are the topography? When you have winds across topography, do you see an excitation in bottom mixing, bottom turbulence, vertical velocity in the bottom layer, all those sort of things. Yeah, so part two, I guess I should take all questions at the end rather than, yeah, what am I doing in Hamburg? So that was the first part of my PhD. So I sort of pivoted from mathematics to a very mathematical, idealized project. And now I'm trying to pivot again into looking at some more realistic simulations, still modeling, but hopefully with some observations. The motivation is that several people in Hamburg and Bremen are studying these internal wave eddy interactions. So on the left, we have a picture I stole from your website, where we have the tracks of the Agulhas rings passing across a region of very high internal wave activity. If you go a fair way around the world, you get to the Tasman Sea. And here we have the East Australia current down the side of the continent. And similarly to the Agulhas region, not quite, the East Australia current will also kick off these eddies, which propagate southwards through this region, and sometimes they'll make it to the bottom of Tasmania. But you consistently get eddies in this region. And that's interesting because you also have an internal wave beam, which is generated from Macquarie Bridge south of New Zealand. So what I'd like to look at is to, well, learn some of the techniques that are used here and in Bremen, and apply some of these techniques along with my supervisors in Australia to do a similar study using our model and in this Australian region and compare the results with what you find in your institution. So on the right, yes, this is my regional model. Oh, sorry, I'll talk about the region first. So these are studies from Waterhouse and Zhao, where they look at, so this is the internal wave beam energy flux from satellite altimetry, and you see this really dark band from Macquarie Ridge across to the Tasman Rise. Here we have a bunch of moorings that Amy Waterhouse and a few others from Scripps did in 2015. yeah, so there's a very strong coherent M2 tidal beam. It's been studied a fair bit. And yeah, also got the eddies like I talked about. And we'd like to track both the energy of the tidal beam from the model and also track the energy of the eddies. And so I'm going to run the model in, or have run the model in a couple of different cases. So we have a fully forced case where we have reanalysis data from on the surface and the boundaries from the Copernicus data center. We have the same forcing, but with no tides. And we have the same region, but I flatten everything, remove all the forcing, and we have only tides. So the idea is to use those three different cases to pull apart the energy pathways. So, I mean, if we might see a signal of changing eddy energy, for example, in the presence of tides, and likewise changing energy of the tidal beam when there are eddies versus where there's not. And we'll do some validation as well, just to make sure our model spectra are matching what the spectra were for the moorings. And yeah, so just quickly about my model, we're doing it's a 20th degree layer MOM6 model, like I said, with Glory's reanalysis. And so here we have a snapshot of, see this East Australia current with the filaments and eddies that it spins off. We've got bits of the Antarctic circumpolar current down here, and some fun boundary effects, Carsten, from the, yeah, if you're doing open boundaries and eddies, they don't go well together sometimes, but at least the middle of the domain looks okay. And then here we have very light, yeah, you can see we do get the internal tidal beam here. So this is just a snapshot of speed along the isopycnals in the case where we only had the tides. So next we're looking at this. So this is a transect that follows this red arrow. And firstly, this is in the absence of forcing. So this is the tides only run. And you can see the generation site is Macquarie Ridge to the right. I was quite short. Green, we have the isopycnals, which are bobbing up and down. And you can see this pattern of the M2 tide reflecting from the surface coming down. And the only thing that's messing up the beam really is this, the topography in the middle. So it was suggested that we could also do a run where we just delete all the topography here and only leave the generation site, so we can really have a coherent beam. And secondly, same thing, but with all the forcing. So now it's a bit more messy, but you can see the East Australia current over here, but you still have the tidal signal. And if you plot this as a Hofmöller, which I think I forgot to put in the presentation, you can still see the tidal beam quite clearly, but it sort of gets a bit messed up and modulated by all the other stuff that's going on. Yeah, so that's where I'm up to now. I sort of just finished running those models before I left Australia. And then, yeah, with this trip, I was hoping to learn about, yeah, how things are done here and what the next steps should be for this project. And I think I've got, yeah, there we go. Yeah, so we want to compare the spectra of the isopycnal displacements at different points of the beam and the observations. And like I said, calculate the wave energy flux and how that changes in the different models. Split that so that we've got this whole year time series for each of the models. And I'd like to split that up and categorize whether there's an eddy there or there's not an eddy, or maybe there's like part of an eddy, and statistically see how whether there's a difference between the tidal and non-tidal cases. And likewise track the eddies, like I said before. And yeah, that's about it. So thanks very much for listening.